again. My name is Wesonga, and I'm a product manager with the Microsoft CXC Cloud Ecosystem Security team. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to you today about the A Day in the Life series for Microsoft Defender for Cloud. It's a session that's going to involve how we see different personas from the security operations lifecycle within different organizations and how they are able to actually use Microsoft Defender for Cloud. I'm not alone in this journey. I also have my colleague Bojan, who I'm actually going to allow to introduce himself before we proceed. Bojan, over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and hi all. Delighted to be joining you today to give you a first-hand glimpse into how you can operationalize Defender for Cloud in this very special webinar that we have in store for you today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Sean to kick us off.
Thanks, Bojan. Great. So switching gears, before we get into who these different personas are and how they're actually using Microsoft Defender for Cloud, it's always good to define what we're calling the customer problem framework. To set the stage, we're basically helping understand and help you focus on how different customers see what essentially matters. We want to be able to help these customers figure out how Microsoft Defender for Cloud meets different needs and align different use cases that essentially make sense for different personas around the security operations lifecycle. In this case, we shall be looking at the view from a security perspective for three key groups. These are the decision makers, the practitioners, and the influencers. And each individual groups will have defined personas basically aligned towards them. And those will be focusing on specific security areas around the overall security lifecycle of an organization. For example, we have a CIO or a CISO. Now, if you think about some of the key things that a CIO or a CISO would be interested in, they'd be interested in understanding what's the overall operational risk, cost, compliance, and regulatory standards. What we are doing with this session is we will give you a view in terms of leveraging Defender for Cloud and bringing in visibility around those focus areas and highlighting how the tool can actually be used in such a scenario. Just to take another example, we'll look at a security analyst as well. Those are the people that are primarily tasked with incident response and protection. So from a focus area, they'll be interested in understanding ways in terms of how they can prevent attacks, proactively look around the coverage across the organization, and ensure that they're able to respond towards threats that are actually occurring in the organization. Now, based off of this, we're going to narrow down our discussion to four key personas. We'll be looking at the security engineer, the security analyst, workload owners, and we will conclude it with decision makers, security management. Now, switching gears, we're going to go in towards the first persona, which is the security engineer. Now, if you think about a security engineer, these are the persons that are charged with the key roles of maintaining and updating tools and systems. Now, if you think about what this means in regards to Defender for Cloud, we are looking at it in terms of four specific areas. The first area which we would like to have a discussion on is plan enablement. From the onset of starting to use Defender for Cloud, you realize we do have a myriad of different plans that sprawl across different workloads. So these could be ranging from your servers to your containers to your storage across other areas as well. Onus is on the security engineer to understand the coverage of the overall organization and ensure that the plans are enabled based off of what's actually required across the organization and ensuring that the organization is realizing cloud security posture management and cloud workload protection. On top of that, there are different users that would be required to use Defender for Cloud, and each of those users will actually require to have specific roles and permissions. One of the key roles for the security engineer would to ensure that he's assigning specific permissions towards each and every of these users to ensure that each and every of the tasks that are required are actually achieved appropriately. And for example, admin rights are not being extended towards external users as well. Moving over, we have the second functionality, which is alert tuning. Defender for Cloud does generate alerts depending on different areas that are triggered based off of advanced detections in Defender for Cloud. These alerts are used for correlation and other signals across resources to generate incidents. Onus is on the security engineer to ensure that once the alerts are generated, they are basically forwarded towards SIEMs or any other integrated solutions such as ITSM for ticket management solutions as well. It's also the role for the security engineer to create suppression rules to suppress false positives or other unwanted security alerts for Defender for Cloud. The third functionality is automation. And if you think about it, security experts actually recommend different customers, partners, etc., to automate as many steps of any remediative procedures they have within the organization. Automation can help reduce overhead, and it can basically help in improving how you manage your security by giving you the ability to quickly, consistently respond towards threats and incidents that have actually generated within Defender for Cloud. The SOC engineer has the owners to ensure that the workflow automation is actually in place and the playbooks that are actually created are configured appropriately and don't have any authentication challenges as well. Last but not least, we have the agent and extension monitoring. Within Defender for Cloud, as mentioned earlier, we do have different plans, and those different plans actually utilize quite a number of agents. Onus is on the SOC engineer to ensure that proper deployment of those agents are done across the board, and they can do this by also ensuring they're able to monitor the coverage across the different areas by leveraging workbooks that have actually been created, such as the monitoring agent health. With that, I want to push it over towards Bojan to show how a security engineer would actually use and deliver these functionalities with the Defender for Cloud. Over to you, Bojan.
Amazing, Sean. Thank you. So what we thought we would do now is switch gears and go over into the Azure portal to really show you how a security engineer can use Defender for Cloud on their day-to-day basis. So what I've done here, I went ahead and logged into Azure and navigated to the Microsoft Defender for Cloud dashboard. Now, as a security engineer, as Sean mentioned, I'm really tasked with ensuring that I'm not just managing Defender for Cloud, but that all of the resources that my organization has either in Azure or outside of Azure, such as in AWS, GCP, and on-premises, that are covered with Microsoft Defender for Cloud's capabilities, which among others include not just security posture management, but also threat detection. So as a security engineer, a good place for me to start is go over to the environment settings blade. So here I'm able to see the different subscriptions as well as AWS and GCP environments that I have onboarded to Defender for Cloud. Now, what I want to do is I want to ensure that I've enabled threat detection across the different subscriptions which Defender for Cloud is covering, again, to help me identify potential signs of compromise and alert me of suspicious activities for my resources. So I'm going to click a particular subscription here, and to enable Defender for Cloud's threat detection capabilities, what I need to do here is I need to ensure that the different plans that I see here are enabled. I can enable Microsoft Defender for Cloud's threat detection capabilities for compute resources, such as virtual machines, Azure App Service, containers. I can also enable it for data, for different databases, even for Azure storage, as well as for the Azure Service Layer itself, which would then include Key Vault, Azure Resource Manager, and Azure DNS. So once I've ensured that all of these have been enabled, depending on the requirements for my environment, I can also ensure that the relevant components that are needed, for example, for threat detection capabilities for servers, databases, and containers are deployed as well, for which I can select settings and monitoring and leverage a capability of Defender for Cloud, which is called auto provisioning. Again, to ensure that everything is provisioned to those resource types to ensure that I get the most value out of the different Defender for Cloud plans, which will then alert me of potentially suspicious activities and signs of compromise. Now, after I've enabled the threat detection capabilities, by default, whenever there is a high severity security alert, Defender for Cloud will send notifications to the subscription owner. For me to ensure as a security engineer that all of the relevant folks inside of my organization are notified when Defender for Cloud does detect suspicious activities, I'm going to go over to the email notifications section. Here I can configure what are the roles that should be receiving notifications and when Defender for Cloud does actually pick up on suspicious activities. As you can see here, I can not just only input email addresses, but I can also select specific roles such as the subscription owner or the subscription contributor, as well as different roles such as the service admin. What I can also do is I can select from which severity and higher would I like for these roles to and people to be notified. So imagine if I wanted to ensure that for every high severity alert or even from medium onwards, both the subscription owner and the contributor are notified by email of this. So for that, I would go here, I would select owner, I would select contributor, and I would put here medium, and most importantly, click save. This would ensure whenever Defender for Cloud does generate or trigger a security alert with medium or higher severity, that these roles are notified. But Sean also touched upon a great point about 1 + 1 equaling 3, where I want to ensure that different solutions that I'm using are adding more value to my team and to my organization than them working in silos. And there is a need to also take data from Defender for Cloud and stream it to other systems, such as, for example, a security information and event management system or a different type of a system. For this, I can configure continuous export. And continuous export allows me then to specify where do I want to take this data to. As you can see here, I have two options presented to me, either Event Hub or a Log Analytics workspace. And that begs the question, do I want to take data outside of Azure, or do I want to keep Microsoft Defender for Cloud data inside of Azure? If I want to take it outside of Azure, for example, to my on-premises team, I can then choose here Event Hub, and for Event Hub, then export it to a theme of choice, and I can even here find information on how to do that. What I can also do, however, is I can keep it in Azure, for which I can select the Log Analytics workspace, which allows me to answer what data I would like to stream. So it can be security recommendations, some information about misconfigurations that Defender for Cloud has picked up, either security alerts, regular compliance data. Then in addition to what data, I need to specify the frequency or how often. And I can select streaming updates. So whenever there is a change, Defender for Cloud is going to stream that relevant change. And I can also select snapshot, which will then be export on a weekly basis. And the last question I need to answer is to where should this data be exported, for which I can then select here a subscription and the targeted the Log Analytics workspace. I know it can be really daunting to consider continuous export as a data dump. More accurate though it would be to consider it as streaming of alerts, because after I've selected here the configurations, clicked save, it's not going to go in fetch historic data, but from that point onwards, it's only going to apply for then the new, for example, security alerts that are triggered. Now, as a security engineer at this point, I feel pretty good about myself. What I ensured is by enabling the Defender for Cloud plans that I have threat protection enabled across the board for my resources, the different resource types. Then for email notifications, I also ensure that the relevant folks are notified whenever Defender for Cloud does pick up on suspicious activity or a sign of compromise. And then I also configure continuous export to allow for that data to be streamed to a centralized system that my organization might use to paint the fuller picture or use it as a single pane of glass, such as a SIEM. After I've enabled the different Defender for Cloud plans, then Defender for Cloud will alert me whenever it detects a suspicious activity. And I can see that in the security alert section, where here I can see the different alerts that Defender for Cloud has triggered for my environment. Now, to also ensure that these threat detection capabilities are tweaked for my environment, I can also here create suppression rules. Suppression rules are very, very powerful, but also very, very helpful. Imagine if I was doing a penetration test exercise. Chances are I wouldn't appreciate Defender for Cloud generating a lot of noise around this, as I would consider it to be a false positive. Although I can always manually dismiss an alert, with suppression rules, I can also create a suppression rule that will then programmatically and automatically dismiss specific alerts, and I can even here decide which ones, and I can even specify the different entities. For example, an entity might be a VM on which I'm going to be performing specific tests. And very important is to also mention that rules do have an expiration date. As a best practice, you should ensure that there is an expiration date, so you can then monitor these rules over time. After I've tweaked the threat detection capabilities based on the requirements of my environment, what I can also do is work together with the security analyst to understand what responses we need to put in place as an organization to be more secure. For this, I can leverage workload automation, which allows me to integrate with the proven Azure technology, which is Azure Logic Apps, that allows me for specific either security alerts or even recommendations or regulatory compliance standards. I can trigger a Logic App as a way to responding to what happened. And Logic Apps, for those of you who might not have played around with it that much, it's completely customizable, as well as I can then specify what I want to happen inside of the workflow. And we do have a thriving Microsoft Defender for Cloud community, which is why when I go here to the community section, I see here a link to the official GitHub community repository for Defender for Cloud, where I can also find different folders, one of them here being workflow automation. So I don't even need to start from scratch. I can go here and see what are the different scenarios that people here have contributed based on the most common use cases found in enterprises. And last but not least, also as a security engineer, I want to ensure that what I've done, I can also monitor over time. So they're built-in workbooks that I can use, which are rich data visualizations of Defender for Cloud data. So I can use things such as coverage workbook to understand if there are any gaps in plans across Azure, AWS, and GCP. If so, then I can go back and enable the threat detection capabilities on those subscription and or AWS and GCP equivalent of those, as well as use other workbooks. We have built-in ones here, but I can also, if I go back to the community, to the official Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub repository, I can also here find a folder that says workbooks, which allows me to tap into workbooks created either by the team that I'm part of or by our thriving community, such as the Microsoft Defender for endpoint deployment status, as well as servers monitoring, which are two workbooks that, as a pro tip, I do want to encourage you to look into. With that, I'll pass it back to Sean to guide us through our next role.
Amazing job, Bojan. I think you did a very good job of showing the folks on the call how a security engineer would be able to leverage Microsoft Defender for Cloud against different aspects and different use cases and scenarios. So switching gears, we're moving over towards the next persona, and this one would be the security analyst. Now, if you think about a security analyst, these are persons that can be referred to as the first cybersecurity first responders, right? Their key roles is to report on cyber threats and implement any changes that are essentially needed to protect the organization. Now, if you think about what this means in regards to Defender for Cloud, we're looking at three specific areas. The first part is around alert investigation and response. As I clearly defined earlier, the security analyst's role is to be the first responder and report on threats while implementing changes to protect the organization. The analyst will have visibility of alerts and basically triage them based on severity and MITRE attack tactics while investigating the alerts that essentially and they need to put in place remediation actions, as some of those actions would essentially not just involve the security analyst, but also other personas such as workload owners. It's the job for the security analyst to assign different owners those defined remediative actions and ensure they are done by aligning them with due dates and other specific areas of visibility. A good example would be, for example, if you get an alert based out of a virtual machine that's publicly facing, right? And the remediative action would be to ensure that that virtual machine implements just-in-time virtual machine access to ensure that it's accessed from a secure perspective. The security analyst can put in place an action and assign a workload owner that specific action to basically put in place JIT in regards towards that specific virtual machine. Secondly, we have proactive detection stroke campaign detection. Through Defender for Cloud, and the security analyst has access to what's known as the inventory blade, and they're able to align each and every workload with a security posture view and provide specific recommendations that are needed to put in place to ensure the posture is improved and security is enhanced, amongst other benefits as well. Secondly, during Ignite, we recently announced the Cloud Security Graph, and in specific functionality to deal with Cloud Security Explorer and attack path analysis. The security analyst can use, for example, the Cloud Security Explorer to proactively look for potential threat campaigns within their current environment. For example, what was popular last year was the Log4j sort of threat campaign. What the security analyst can do leveraging the Cloud Security Explorer is query virtual machines with certain CVE information in relation to Log4j, and to be able to determine whether or not they are particularly impacted and push remediative actions such as installing updates that ensure that their environment is not impacted by Log4j. Last but not least, we have action on regulatory compliance recommendations. Proceeding to the recommendations compliance blade, the security analyst can understand the current environment performance based off of those defined standards. Now, if you have worked with Defender for Cloud, you are familiar that you are able to basically query and see how your environment is performing based off of common industry standards. These could sprawl from ISO, NIST, HIPAA Trust, and even cloud-specific regulations. Having this information, they can basically apply and implement recommendations and controls into the environment to improve the overall organization security and posture. With that specific summary, I want to push it back to Bojan, who's actually going to show us how a security analyst would practically use Defender for Cloud. Bojan, back to you.
Amazing, Sean. So let's go back to the Microsoft Defender for Cloud dashboard, but this time let's focus more on how does a security analyst use Defender for Cloud on their day-to-day basis. The place I'd like to start with is the security alerts dashboard. Now, this is that central place where Defender for Cloud is going to surface the suspicious activities and potential signs of compromise it has detected for my environment. As a security analyst, as I go about then triaging what has happened here, a big thing for me is also prioritization. And I have at times, depending on the tier of in which the security analyst can be mapped back to, be it tier 1, tier 2, or maybe even someone who's more on the proactive hunting side, I know that minutes matter. And at times I might actually have only a couple of minutes to understand if something is potentially suspicious or malicious, and then pass it over to a more senior analyst or just move on. What I can use here to help me in my prioritization process is the security alerts severity. So Defender for Cloud here, I see surfaced 3 severities: high, medium, and low. Whenever there is a suspicious activity, Defender for Cloud will surface an alert for me, a security alert in my environment. Now, if it has a high severity, this means that Defender for Cloud is confident that the resource has been compromised. Medium signifies the resource might have been compromised, and the low means there was an activity that, taking into consideration other context, might represent that the resource was compromised. For low severity security alerts, I'd like to offer an example that can be like clearing logs, which in some organizations is done routinely, but then again, it might also be indicative of a bad actor trying to hide their tracks. I can use these three severities as I go about triaging and then investigating further what has happened here. What I can also use are these filters that you can see here, and also Sean touched upon a very important one, which is the MITRE attack tactics. So both Defender for Cloud security alerts as well as recommendations have an integration with the MITRE attack framework. MITRE helps me by distilling the knowledge of the industry based on attack campaigns as well as breaches, and really helps me understand what are the different phases that bad actors could look to go through to compromise my environment. And based on the different MITRE attack tactics, I can even use that to again prioritize as I go about investigating and triaging security alerts. To give you a sense of how this looks like, I'm going to pick this alert, which has both a high severity and it's a suspected brute force attack on a SQL machine. So when I select this security alert, I'm able to see here more information. If I want to start working on it, I'm going to go ahead and move the status to in progress, and I can then even click on view fuel details that provides me even more information about what has actually happened here. So I'm able to see more information as well as around the different entities that were involved, such as which account was used, on which machine in question, from which IP. I can even here see a recently introduced capability, which allows me then to also gain a little bit more insights as to, hey, but why did Defender for Cloud surface or generate this security alert? And here I can see that in a relatively short period of time, there were many false login attempts indicative of an brute force attack against this specific asset that Defender for Cloud is protecting. Now, what I can then do is I can either click on the button Take Action or to the Take Action tab. This is helpful because it provides me with steps that I can take to mitigate this current threat to my environment. But in addition to it, I can also see by remediating what misconfigurations in my environment, I can prevent these kind of attacks and security alerts being triggered in the future. And I can see here the top 3 security recommendations that Defender for Cloud has picked up from my workloads that I need to remediate to close off the chances for this happening again into the future. And again, I can also here have integration with logic apps that I use to trigger a logic app as a response, and as well as work with the security engineer, which, as you recall, was our first role, to set up workflow automation rules, which can then do this thing programmatically as well as automatically. Now, what as a security analyst, I also want to ensure is I identify the risk to my environment, for which, as Sean pointed out, I can use the Cloud Security Graph, on top of which 2 features are built, namely the Cloud Security Explorer, which allows me either to leverage here built-in templates, which allow me really to take what's already there, or just use this drop-down to assemble graph-based queries of my environment based on my knowledge of the environment, so I can identify what is exploitable and what has business impact. I can also use insights already provided by Microsoft. If I switch over to the recommendations dashboard, here I also have attack pods. And attack pods are Microsoft's way of sharing with me, hey, these are the potential entry points for bad actors to your environment that we highly encourage you to prioritize in remediating and resolving. So one might be actually that a internet exposed EC2 instance has both high severity vulnerabilities, but also read permission to key management system. So if I select this one, for example, I'm able then to see here also a graphical representation of this, allowing me to then have a lot of insights inside of one single place, again, helping me identify the risk to my environment and work on minimizing that identified risk so my security posture is improved and my resources are hardened. I'd like to close it off also by sharing with you, as Sean pointed out, that there is also a need not just to improve the security posture, but many organizations do require to then ensure that the state of their configurations of resources map back to specific regulatory compliance standards, such as NIST. It can be HIPAA for healthcare providers. It can be PCI DSS, for example, if you're handling customer credit card information as an example. And here I can really see then what security technical controls are failing, and I can work on remediating them. I can even here, when I select control details, get a better understanding of the control itself, what I need to perform, and what Microsoft is doing on their end as part of the shared responsibility model. With that quick overview, I'll pass it back to Sean to guide us through our next role.
Thanks for that, Bojan. Amazing job again. Now, moving over, we're going towards the next persona, which is the workload owner. Now, this is a person who's responsible for deploying workloads and remediating misconfigurations and vulnerabilities that the security team discovers. Now, if you think about it, as mentioned earlier, one of the key functionalities of the security analyst would be assigning owners different defined actions based off of what they have actually discovered within their incident response and investigations. The workload owner is essentially where that comes into play, and it falls within the first defined use case and how they're able to use Defender for Cloud, which is remediating misconfigurations. I already talked about how an analyst can essentially work with them, but what would this actually mean in terms of actions? I talked about a use case of one requiring to implement JIT based off of alert that was actually created by the solution, and the security analyst shared it with the workload owner. It could be with other actions such as adding multi-factor authentication on a defined solution, applying system updates on a machine, or even closing exposed ports, amongst other defined scenarios as well. Moving over towards the second use case, it's around asset inventory. It's always good for the workload owner to have greater visibility of the current coverage of their current workloads. As they head over towards the inventory blade, they can see a greater understanding of what's being covered by Defender for Cloud, get visibility if agents have actually been installed on the defined workloads, but most importantly, capture the recommendations that have been suggested by the tool to improve the security posture of the workloads and by virtue the overall environment as well. Third, we have regulatory compliance. Now, being that this is a workload owner, they understand the current policies and industry standards their workloads essentially need to align on across the board as well. As they move over towards the regulatory compliance blade, they can understand how their workloads and implementations are set up and whether or not they are aligning towards those regulatory standards. And if not, they can action the defined recommendations and ensure that those particular controls are actually applied to their defined workloads as well. Last but not least, it's around data visualization. One of the key benefits with Defender for Cloud is an access to a myriad of different workbooks across the tool. If you can remember, Bojan showed a couple of them in the first demo. As a workload owner, having access to these specific workbooks can help you run a number of different defined scenarios, whether it's understanding your overall coverage, understanding the vulnerability view across your defined workloads, understanding how your compliance or even any defined governance scenarios. You have the workload owner has access to those workbooks and they can apply them in their day-to-day operations to ensure that they're improving the way they work, but also in terms of how they use Defender for Cloud. Now, with that, pushing it back to Bojan to take us through a couple of these scenarios, then we'll conclude with the last persona.
Amazing, Sean. And it's demo time again. So we are back in the Microsoft Defender for Cloud dashboard. This time around, we're focusing on the workload owners, who are, as Sean mentioned, really responsible for specific digital services that run on particular resources in your environment, which can even span multi-cloud, and then owning the remediation of any misconfigurations and vulnerabilities found on those resources by the relevant security operations center folks or security teams. So a big thing for me as a workload owner is, before I now go into more of what I can do, to just realize that Defender for Cloud also leverages Azure RBAC, which is a great thing, because through that, then the security engineer, who, just to remind you, was our first role, can also configure and give me permission so I can see misconfigurations for my specific resources and not for the entire organization. So it even allows me just to be aware of what's pertinent to my resources through Azure RBAC. So something very important to call out. As a workload owner, I'd like to start in the recommendations dashboard. Here I can then see what are the misconfigurations that Defender for Cloud has detected on my resources. I can even select to expand all of them, employ a top-down approach using the max score as well as the potential score increase to understand which ones I should look to prioritize. So secure score increases, and by secure score increasing, which I can consider as the singular security KPI, I can also effectively improve the security posture of my environment, as well as harden my resources against potential signs of compromise. We know that in addition to detecting misconfigurations, and I'll just select one here, which is that the log analytics agent should be installed on my virtual machines. We also, by working with organizations, realize that this is a process that it isn't just being detected by the security folks, it's also working together with the workload owners to drive the remediation process. So as a workload owner, what I can also do is, once I've been notified by the security folks as to the misconfigurations and vulnerabilities on the resources that my team is either responsible for or owns, I can even here select the resources which are unhealthy, and I can ensure that I drive accountability of the remediation process by here specifying the owner, which can be, I'll just assign this to my good friend Sean. I just need to make sure the domain is accurate as well. And I can also specify until when Sean, in this case, has time to remediate this. Now, installing a log analytics agent shouldn't take that long. So Sean, hopefully you're good until end of next week. I can also specify if I want for until this due date is reached for this unhealthy resource state to affect secure score or not. If I don't want it to affect secure score until after, in this case, January 27, I can go ahead and select it here, as well as optional configurations such as notifying the owners of their weekly open and overdue tasks. Overdue meaning if it goes beyond the due date, as well as through Azure Active Directory integration, notifying their direct management. So after I do this, I'll just go ahead and click on save, which is going to ensure that Sean then has visibility of the misconfigurations and really accountability of the remediation process itself. As a workload owner, I can do this then for the other misconfigurations that Defender for Cloud has detected in form of recommendations. And as a best practice, I want to ensure that every recommendation has an owner and a due date assigned to it. The reason is that helps drive accountability It helps ensure that no misconfigurations falls through the cracks, and then I can also track it and I can also monitor its progress. What I can also do is after I assign these items, let's say when Sean now logs in, he can even use this filter to only give him an overview of the recommendation that he has been assigned as an owner to, again, helping him to prioritize on the work at hand. Now, what I also want to here cover is very, very quickly the attack paths capability that I showed when we spoke about the security analyst. So this is also very beneficial to workload owners because it allows me then for the resources that I own inside of the organization. It shows me the identified risk to them, as well as the recommendations that I should prioritize based on those resources being exploitable and having business impact to my organization. But business impact doesn't just include attack paths. Business impact can be also other things. So imagine if I had specific VMs that were running services that I deem to be critical for my business, such as a revenue generating app. Chances are I would like to also zoom into those resources to understand if Defender for Cloud has detected any misconfigurations or any threats whatsoever to them. For this, I can also leverage the inventory blade. So the inventory blade allows me then to have asset inventory of sorts of the resources covered by Defender for Cloud's protection, where if I, for example, select here a specific VM, I can then see what plans are enabled on it. So in this case, I see that Defender for Servers is enabled, but the monitoring agent is not installed. So I need to also make sure that I remediate this, as well as the other misconfigurations that Defender for Cloud has highlighted here under recommendation for this particular resource. In addition, I can also see what security alerts have been detected and triggered by Defender for Cloud, as well as the installed software. And then through the installed software, I'm able to get a sense of what commonly common exposure and vulnerabilities have been in that identified in that software, again helping me to ensure that if this was a business critical resource for my organization, that it's fully hardened, that it doesn't have any misconfigurations, and that it's running smoothly. Last but not least, I, as a workload owner, can also leverage workbooks to get a sense of the remediation process and track it. One workbook I can leverage is the governance workbook, which is going to show me the owners as well as how the remediation process is going for specific here subscriptions. What I can also do as a workload owner, if I need to, and a lot of organizations have a requirement for this, to ensure that the configurations of my resources are in alignment with security technical controls of specific regulatory compliance standards. For this, I can leverage the regulatory compliance dashboard. Here I see standards which can be either Microsoft built-in standards. I can even here add my own standards through a custom policy initiative. And I can go about then understanding which controls are failing. And for each specific compliance control, I see the assessments, meaning the recommendations that are mapped to it, allowing me then to also ensure that it aligns to specific regulatory compliance standards, for example, such as PCI DSS. With that, over to you, Sean, for our last rope for today.
Thanks for that, Bojan. And last but not least, we go to one of the most important personas around the overall security lifecycle, and this is the security manager stroke decision maker. Now, this is a person that's tasked with the responsibility of establishing security-related strategies, policies, and operations. More or less, this is the leader from the security perspective. Now, in terms of Defender for Cloud, we are looking at a couple of areas where we see the security manager being able to interface with the solution. The first aspect is around remediating compliance. As it's very common with security managers, they are keen on understanding how the organization is performing from a compliance perspective. Additionally, this following persona will be interfacing and answering questions in regards towards audit that is very important towards the organization. With Defender for Cloud, the security manager has access towards the regulatory compliance plate, and they can determine how these different standards are being applied and identify potential pitfalls, download and share audit reports, as well as evaluate different compliance offerings and how the environment is basically measuring against that as well. Moving over towards the next aspect, it's cost management. Security managers actually have a core responsibility for managing costs. As Defender for Cloud is a consumption-based product, the utilization over time requires to essentially be within a defined budget that has actually been defined before. Having access towards Defender for Cloud, they can proceed to leverage one of the workbooks that actually help them determine and estimate the actual cost. This, we're talking about the cost estimation workbook that was sort of shown by Bojan earlier. In that workbook, you're able to get visibility of the different plans, and depending on the workloads covered, you can actually get a defined estimation of the potential spend and proactively start to work to ensure that you are within budget and not having issues from a cost management perspective. We have the governance preview, and the security manager here can make sure the organization is systematically improving its overall security posture by defining rules that assign an owner and set the due date for resources in the specified recommendations. These ways, resource owners have clear sets of tasks and deadlines for remediating defined recommendations, and this has actually been shown by some of the demos. Now, as a security manager, if you can actually manage that process, you can ensure that tasks are actually not exceeding their due dates, and each and everything that needs to be remediated is being done in a timely manner. We have the attack campaign and proactive views. And here it's very simple. We talked about the cloud security graph, the explorer, and the attack paths. As a manager, you need to be able to determine your overall risks. So understanding what's current from a threat campaign's perspective, be able to get visibility of your overall exposure, and helping with the enforcement of remediating and probably enhancing recommendations is one of the key functionalities as well. Last but not least, it's reporting. And for a security manager, reporting is key. And as mentioned, we have a myriad of different workbooks that can help improve the way a security manager drives the overall operations. I'm going to mention but a few, and that are very key for a security manager. We have the compliance over time workbook that basically shows how an organization is improving or not improving their compliance over a period of time. I'm sure we're very familiar with Defender for Cloud and Secure Score. We have a workbook that's basically able to track that secure score over time. We also have governance preview workbooks. We have zero-day exploitation workbooks, and all those defined workbooks can help improve how a security manager drives and manages their overall operations in the organization while leveraging Defender for Cloud. Now, concluding that, I'm going to push it back to Bojan, who's going to take us through a couple of these scenarios. Then we'll conclude it and open it up for Q&A. Bojan.
Amazing as usual, Sean. So last demo for today, folks, we're back in the Microsoft Defender for Cloud dashboard, but this time around really focusing on the decision maker, such as a security manager or any kind of actually security leader inside of an organization. And we all know that what gets measured gets improved. So as a security manager, I can go and use workbooks to give me a sense of various different aspects. It can even be, for example, any gaps that we have in our environment with regards to threat detection capabilities. So I can leverage the coverage workbook. I can get insights for Azure, as well as if I onboarded my AWS and GCP environment for Defender for Cloud, that helps me identify if there are any gaps in my my security posture. If they are, such as the ones that you see here for this subscription, I can then task the security or the SOC engineer to go about remediating this and fixing it. What I can also do as a security leader is once I've then identified the gaps and am convinced in its value, one thing that's also important for me is also being able to have a price point so I can estimate what would these threat detection capabilities cost me. For this, I can leverage the cost estimation workbook, which then provides me a sense based on my resources telemetry of my environment as to what would be the pricing implications for enabling different Defender for Cloud plans that I can select here. And I could even go as granular, for example, for Defender for servers by choosing P1 and P2, so plan 1 or plan 2, and see the differences based on the capabilities for my resources. Now, this also allows me then to have an estimation that I can budget for, that I can also talk to either my directors or either to the board, so we can get the investments that we need to improve the overall security posture of our organization. A couple of other workbooks that I can use to empower me to get greater visibility so I can then either assign different folks to address it or also take it in consideration with the team is being able to understand how is my security posture of my environment performing over time. For this, I can leverage the Secure Score Over Time workbook, and this allows me when I select the workspace in which I store then data for which I can use continuous export. I can then see how has the security posture of my environment been performing over time. What I want to be on the lookout for is for increases. So stagnation means that we're not actually moving the needle with regards to improving our security posture. And if I have a secure score of less than 40%, that's a cause for concern. I see progress here, but then I also see a drop in straight afterwards, which can be also indicative that what's being deployed, it's not adhering to security best practice guidance. So I can even use this information to then identify as to what recommendations have the most resources, so I can feed this back into the organization, so I can evolve the way that we go about deploying resources to Azure, AWS, GCP, to again ensure that what we're deploying aligns to security best practices, that Defender for Cloud then realizes it by secure score, either maintaining a high level or going above. I often got asked what secure score should we as an organization strive for. While the product is able to technically achieve 100%, we do encourage having a secure score above 80% and most importantly maintaining it, so not seeing these dips of secure score happening over time, which again might be indicative of resources being deployed that are not adherent to security best practices. Another workbook I can use for a very similar use case is the compliance over time, which allows me to then get a sense, but more for the technical security controls of particular regulatory compliance standards, as well as to see, and I might not have actually picked the best example here, so sorry about that, folks, but this would also then allow me to get a better understanding of my compliance posture over time. What I can also do is anytime I can also go to the regulatory compliance blade, which gives me a point in time view. So it gives me in this moment where I'm in here, it gives me an understanding of how does today at this time my environment adhere, for example, to security technical controls of PCI DSS. As you can see, there's a lot of red here, and I can expand specific compliance control groups and compliance controls to get a better understanding of what are then the resources that I need to remediate, as well as the necessary recommendation. What I'm also interested in, because we obviously live in a day where new vulnerabilities get detected on a daily basis, some which were even previously unknown, such as zero-day exploits, for which I can also, using the Cloud Security Explorer, I can then use a query to understand whenever I found information about the CVE ID of a new 0-day, I can then use this to even proactively understand which resources are impacted by this in my environment. So I can even proactively start to plan, okay, so these are the resources, this is the identified risk then to my environment, how do I mitigate this? As soon as we have a patch, these are the folks I'm going to task with remediating it, for which I can obviously again leverage the capability to assign owners and due date, which is called security governance in Defender for Cloud. With that, I want to make sure we end on a high note, and I'm really interested in seeing what questions you have for us. So I'll pass it over to Sean to close it off.
Thanks for that, Boyan. And I'll just conclude, with a couple of seconds. What we have gone through is talked about different personas and essentially how they can use Defender for Cloud. I hope, if you have any ideas, any thoughts, feel free to share it with us, but I'll open it up for Q&A and I'll move it over towards Jason to pick some questions for us to respond to.
Great, thanks, Sean. The team's been great with answering questions, but I think there's a few we could reiterate. The first one is, does Defender for Cloud have Active Directory on-premise assessment available? Before in the Security Center, there was an AD assessment module.
Great question. It goes a little bit towards also the positioning of Defender for Cloud. And at a very, very high level, the product promise of Defender for Cloud is to provide you with visibility of your IaaS and PaaS workloads, whether it be inside of Azure or outside of Azure through the integration with Azure Arc. With that being said, there are obviously use cases that fall outside of it. It's not that Microsoft as such can't address it. It's more that other solutions are better positioned for it. So for example, for on-premises Active Directory, the solution to look more into would obviously be MDI, Microsoft Defender for Identity.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is, if you are running a third-party endpoint protection, will enabling the free CSPM have any conflict issues? Looking at the added VM scanning capability.
It's a great question because historically, or I should better say, in November, we actually introduced the premium CSPM capabilities that come in the form of the Defender Cloud Security Posture Management or Defender CSPM plan. As part of Defender CSPM plan, as you alluded to, we also nowadays have an agentless vulnerability assessment capability for machines, which is exactly that. So it's based on this snapshotting. It takes snapshots of your disks. It then uses Microsoft Defender vulnerability management to provide and detect any vulnerabilities and surface that information in Defender for Cloud. And because it's agentless, it obviously does not have any impact on your production workloads, and it does not install any agents or extensions to it. That's not to negate the need for those. We still, if you do require deep threat protection, that's something obviously we do support through, for example, Microsoft Defender for Servers as a plan. But for cloud security posture management in this specific case, if you're using Defender CSPM, there shouldn't be no issue. No.
Great, thank you. And the last question we have time for is there any Azure policy to disable rules at the resource group level?
I see we actually have a couple more, so let me also offer to stay one additional minute so we can take even a couple of other questions.
Oh, sure.
We would definitely need to check that one. Azure policy, the definitions get added daily. So I would need to confirm that, but we can also then share it either through the YouTube channel, comments, or through another way.
Oh, great, thank you. The next one is there a tip to enable CMMC compliance on the benchmarks? Is that an add-on for fee item?
Okay, CMMC compliance. CMMC compliance is not one of capabilities that we do actually speak about often, but it's something that we also have a team that worked on it, and it's something we can also then share in the chat window more information about, because that can even be a conversation on its own. So make sure to share the information in the chat window about that.
Great. And then we have another here. We have both Defender for Cloud and MS Sentinel enabled. What are best practices? Do we forward everything to Sentinel and stop checking Defender for Cloud recommendations, or does Defender for Cloud offer things Sentinel will not check?
Great question. It goes a little bit, it's twofold. One is what data should you have in Sentinel, and the other is, well, why then, what is your single source of truth when you do detect something? What I see in clients that I work with is they use Defender for Cloud to cover their resources, which can be compute data or the service layer, and it can also be multi-cloud. They then use the different Defender for Cloud plans to detect on any kind of suspicious activities or potential signs of compromise. So they consider then Defender for Cloud to be the single source of truth for that, and that gets then sent to Sentinel. Just as an FYI, two considerations when you're sending Defender for Cloud security alerts to Sentinel, it's not done through the continuous export, it's done through on the Sentinel side for the native connector. And secondly, is you should be aware of that if you're using a default workspace a log analytics workspace created by Defender for Cloud, that cannot be used in combination with Sentinel. So you would need to use a custom one. So Jason, do we have any last questions before we need to drop? We have time for one more.
Yeah, I think we do. Let's see here. Must Defender for Cloud be enabled for subscription? Can it be enabled for a resource group?
So Defender for Cloud plans have historically and continue to be enabled on the subscription level. Thank you for the feedback. I'm more than happy to also take a note of having it enabled more granularly. The thing we need to keep in mind then is it goes back to the conversation about the weakest link. And if we allow granularity at the same time, we want to ensure that it's not decreasing the security posture of organizations by them having then more gaps in their overall security posture, which is why even historically we focused on the subscription to make sure that all of the resources inside of that subscription are covered.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have time for. So I'd like to thank you, Bojan and Sean, for being our guests today and for an excellent presentation. And thank you to the rest of the team who helped answer questions. At the same time, I would like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements is to visit our landing page at aka.ms/security-community. And while there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to our security products and their communities. A good start would be browsing our bite-sized product videos, ninja trainings, recordings of past webinars, GitHub communities, and more. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. Please take a minute submitting your webinar feedback at aka.ms/security-webinar feedback. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.